The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning, Hazel Lockhart had already been told she would fail. She stood in the middle of what had once been her father's wheat field, the dead stalks crunching beneath her boots like brittle bones, and she read the words of Clarence Dodd aloud to no one in particular, because there was no one left to hear them. The banker's handwriting was precise and cold, the kind of penmanship that had ruined 1,000 families without a single tremor in the hand that wrote it. Miss Lockhart, it is the considered opinion of the First Territorial Bank of Canyon Creek that the land in question, being parcel 47 of the Lockhart deed, is insufficient collateral given the present state of its cultivation and the demonstrated inability of any single female operator to manage dry land farming at this scale without male supervision or partnership. You have until the first day of October to produce evidence of a productive harvest sufficient to satisfy the outstanding debt of $912, or the bank will proceed with foreclosure proceedings as outlined in the original note signed by your late father, Thomas Edward Lockhart, in the year of our Lord 1874. 1878, the year that was supposed to be different. Hazel folded the letter with hands that did not shake. She had trained herself out of shaking 2 years ago, when her mother died, and then again last winter when her father followed. She was 26 years old and she owned 30 acres of cracked Kansas soil, 1 mule named Prophet, a seed drill that needed a new bolt, and a debt that felt like a stone tied around the neck of everything she had ever loved. The sun was already punishing by 8 in the morning. Out here on the open plain south of Canyon Creek, there was no mercy in the sky, no shade except what you built yourself. Hazel pressed her palm flat against the soil and felt its dryness like a personal accusation. The winter had been too dry, the spring had been too late, and now the summer stretched ahead of her like a test she had not been given the study materials for. She heard a horse before she saw one. The rider came from the north along the ridge road, moving at an unhurried pace that suggested a man who had nowhere urgent to be, or a man who had already decided where he was going and saw no reason to rush the world to meet him. He was tall in the saddle. She could see that even at distance, with the kind of posture that came not from vanity but from long years on horseback. He wore a plain dark hat with a flat brim and a canvas duster that had seen enough seasons to have earned its fading. He pulled up at the fence line, which was also technically his fence line, because Vernon Underwood's land began just where her father's ended, and the boundary had always been a quiet negotiation of neighborly courtesy rather than any hard legal surveying. "Miss Lockhart," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Mr. Underwood," she said, standing up from where she had crouched and folding the banker's letter into her apron pocket with a movement she hoped looked casual. He looked at the field. He did not say anything cruel about it. He did not say anything pitying either. He just looked at it the way a man looked at something he was trying honestly to understand. "I heard about the bank's position," he said finally. "News travels fast in a small county. Dodd told my foreman at the feed store. He was not discreet about it." Vernon Underwood dismounted without invitation, looping his reins over the fence post with a practiced ease. He was 32 years old, dark-haired, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same hard limestone that ran through the creek beds on his property. He had a scar along his left hand from a branding iron accident when he was 19, and steady brown eyes that did not flicker away when he looked at you. "I want to be straightforward with you. I would appreciate that. I could buy this land right now and solve your problem that way. I want you to know that is not what I am here to offer." Something moved in her chest, not gratitude, not yet, something closer to relief that she would not have to refuse him rudely. "Then what are you here to offer?" she asked. He was quiet a moment. A meadowlark called somewhere in the dry grass behind her. The mule, Prophet, lifted his heavy head from where he had been dozing near the water trough and looked at the newcomer with deep suspicion. "Your father ran winter wheat on this parcel for 6 years before the drought, and the debt got ahead of him," Vernon said. I think that was the wrong crop for this soil. The clay content is too high on the eastern quarter for winter wheat to root well, but sorghum would take, so would milo, and if you move the first planting to the low section where the creek bank keeps the moisture longer, you could harvest before October. Hazel stared at him. You have clearly been thinking about my land. I have been thinking about what can grow on it, he said, and there was no apology in his voice, only honesty. Your father was a good man and a bad farmer, Miss Lockhart. I say that with respect. The land is not the problem. The decisions made about the land were the problem. It should have stung. It did sting. But underneath the sting was something useful, something with edges she could hold onto. And if I plant milo and sorghum on the schedule you are describing, she said, do you believe I can produce a harvest sufficient to satisfy $912 of debt by October 1st? He did not answer immediately, which she later came to understand was because he took the question seriously, not because he doubted. Yes, he said, I believe you can. Nobody had said that to her in a very long time. She did not cry. She had trained herself out of that too. Then tell me what needs doing first, she said, and that was how it started. But she should back up further, because nothing that matters ever starts where it looks like it starts. The real beginning was 6 years earlier, though she did not know it then. The real beginning was the summer her father first noticed his wheat was failing and rode over to the Underwood property to ask about soil conditions. And a young rancher of 26 had given him an honest answer that Thomas Lockhart had been too proud and too frightened to act on. Hazel had been 20 at the time, home from her brief schooling in Wichita, and she had watched Vernon Underwood ride back to his own land from the window of the kitchen and thought nothing particular about him except that he sat a horse beautifully. She had thought about other things since. There had been a man in town, a surveyor named Bradley Holt, who had courted her for 8 months in 1875, and then quietly married the daughter of the hardware merchant instead, because the hardware merchant's daughter came with a building on Main Street, and Hazel only came with 30 acres of increasingly desperate farmland and a father who was already coughing through too many cold mornings. She had allowed herself one night of genuine grief over that particular betrayal, the kind of grief that included both the lost man and the lost version of herself who had believed in him, and then she had set it aside and helped her mother nurse her father through his first real illness. The dark past of Hazel Lockhart was not dramatic by any external measure. No outlaws, no kidnappings, no shootouts in the street. It was the quieter kind of dark, the slow accumulation of losses that nobody wrote ballads about, but that sat just as heavy on the chest as any gunshot wound. Her mother gone in the winter of 1876 from pneumonia. Her father gone in the January of 1878 from what the doctor had called general failure, which was his way of saying the man had simply run out of will. The debt passed to her by inheritance, the way debts always pass to the people least able to absorb them. The banker's letters growing more official, the neighbors growing more quietly certain that a woman alone could not hold 30 acres of hard ground together long enough to matter. And then the spring of 1878, which was her season, her one season, the forced choice that was not really a choice at all, because Hazel Lockhart did not know how to give up and she was not about to learn. The first morning she and Vernon Underwood worked the land together, it was made plain immediately that he was not there to take over. He had brought a seed drill that actually functioned, 2 bags of milo seed from his own stores, and a hired hand named Pete who did not speak much but was extraordinarily useful with a post-hole digger. What Vernon had not brought was any suggestion that Hazel step back and let the men handle things. She understood this when he handed her the seed drill's guide rope and said, "You want the rows 15 inches apart on this section. Follow the creek line. I will watch the depth setting from behind and call out if the soil is shifting." She had expected to be managed. She had braced for it the way you braced for a winter wind that you knew was coming. Instead, she was given the rope and the job and the expectation that she would do both well. She did. The Milo seed went in on a morning in late April when the sky was high and pale, and the temperature was mild enough that the soil accepted the planting without resistance. Pete cut the new fence posts along the south edge where the old cedar posts had rotted through. Vernon adjusted the seed drill's depth gauge twice without being asked, silently, in the way of a man who was accustomed to noticing problems and solving them without making a ceremony of it. By noon they had planted the entire low section, 8 acres of dark-turned soil with neat furrows that Hazel had walked herself. She made coffee on the camp stove she had dragged out to the field, because she was not willing to walk back to the house and lose the working hour. Vernon Underwood sat on an overturned feed bucket and drank his coffee black, and did not comment on its quality, which was fortunate because she had let it boil too long and it tasted like boot leather. "What made you decide against selling to Dodd?" he asked. She had not told him about Dodd's offer. The fact that he knew it meant he was paying more attention to her situation than she had fully realized. "Because this was my father's land," she said, "and before him it was the land he crossed half a country to reach, and if I sell it to Clarence Dodd, it will be a grazing lease inside 3 years and the whole thing will be swallowed into the Dodd family holdings and forgotten." "That is a good reason," Vernon said. "Do you have the land you have because it belonged to your family?" she asked. He was quiet a beat. "No, my family was in Tennessee. I came west when I was 18 with $40 and a bad temper. I earned the land the long way." She looked at him with fresh attention. "What was the bad temper about?" He looked back at her with eyes that held their secrets carefully but without cruelty. "My father had a dark past of his own kind. I needed to be somewhere he was not." She understood that too well to press further. In the weeks that followed, a pattern established itself. Vernon would arrive at Hazel's property at first light on 3 or 4 mornings a week, having completed his own early chores beforehand. He brought his expertise in soil management, in irrigation planning, in the particular practical knowledge of what grew and what died in the specific microclimate of Canyon Creek's southern plain. What he did not bring was any condescension. He answered questions directly. He asked her opinion on decisions. When she disagreed with his suggested placement of the irrigation channel, pointing out that the grade fell the wrong way on the northern edge, he looked at the land for a long moment and then said, "You are right. I did not account for the grade change past the old cottonwood." She stored that moment like it was currency. They built the irrigation channel together on a Thursday that turned brutal by mid-morning, the kind of Kansas heat that settled in the lungs and made everything feel underwater. Pete had taken sick that week, and it was just the two of them, which should have felt strange and probably should have felt improper, given the standards of 1878 in a small Kansas county. But the work was too urgent for propriety, and Hazel had never been particularly good at propriety anyway. She was standing in the shallow trench they had been cutting with a spade and a Pulaski, scooping the loosened soil out in long, steady strokes, when the Pulaski handle cracked along the grain under a hard strike. She felt the vibration run up her arms and stopped, looking at the split handle with the particular exhausted frustration of someone who had been managing broken equipment for 2 years straight. Before she could say anything, Vernon had set down his own spade and was examining the crack. "This handle has been failing for a while," he said. "See how the grain is running across instead of along the length. It was a badly made tool to begin with." "Most of what I inherited was badly made," she said, before she could stop herself. He looked up from the handle and met her eyes. There was a pause in the work that felt different from the usual working silence, warmer around its edges. "I have a spare handle at the barn," he said. "I will bring it tomorrow." "I can ride over and get it today," she said. "We are burning light. I will bring it." She let him. She was learning, slowly and with effort, that accepting help and being diminished by help were not the same thing. Vernon Underwood had never once behaved as though her accepting his assistance meant she was less. He behaved as though her accepting his assistance was simply the efficient thing to do, the way any sensible working partnership would operate, and she was starting to understand that this equanimity of his was not indifference. It was respect in its most practical form. There was a night in May, about 3 weeks into the season, when a late frost threatened. The milo was already an inch above the soil, those tiny green fingers just beginning to trust the weather, and a frost at this stage would be catastrophic. Hazel had been watching the sky all day, and by evening she was certain. The temperature was dropping too fast. The stars were too sharp. She spent 2 hours gathering every scrap of straw and old canvas she owned and spreading them over the planted rows, working by lantern light with Prophet helping carry loads because the mule, for all his general suspicion of everything, was reliable when there was clear purpose. She was on her 3rd trip from the barn when a second lantern appeared at the field's edge, and then Vernon was there with 2 of his hands, and they had brought more canvas from his own stores, enough to cover the section she had not yet reached. She stood in the freezing dark and watched him work and felt something unnamed shift in her chest, like a door opening quietly on its own. They covered the milo. The frost came and was serious, and would have killed everything she had planted if the canvas had not gone down in time. In the morning the seedlings were untouched, green and patient and alive under their temporary shelter. She found Vernon at the fence line before dawn, pulling back the canvas on the first row to check the seedlings. He looked up when he heard her boots on the frozen ground. His breath made small clouds in the pale light. "They held," he said. "They held," she agreed. There was a silence between them that was different from all the working silences. It had weight in it, warmth, the specific texture of 2 people who have been through something real together and are both aware of it. "Thank you," Hazel said. "For last night, I mean it." "I know you mean it," he said simply. "I never doubted you would get most of it covered yourself. But not all of it. Nobody covers everything alone." "That is not a failure, Miss Lockhart. That is just the size of a farm." She looked at him in the early light. His face was tired and cold and completely unguarded in the way that very early mornings made faces unguarded. She thought about the night's work and the weeks before it, and the way he had never once in any of it suggested that the outcome here was uncertain because of who she was. "You have never doubted I could do this," she said. It came out not as gratitude exactly, but as an observation, almost a question. "No," he said, "not once." "Why?" He considered the question with the same seriousness he gave to questions about soil and seed depth and water channels. "Because the land responds to understanding, not to strength, and you understand this land. You were born on it. You watched it for 26 years. I had to learn what you already know." She did not know what to do with that. She bent down and pressed her fingers into the soil near the edge of the canvas, feeling the temperature of it, checking the frost penetration. Her hands were already rough from the season's work, the palms calloused in new places, the knuckles cracked from the cold and the constant washing of tools. "Clarence Dodd came to the house yesterday," she said, still looking at the soil. "Vernon went very still. He said he was concerned about my welfare. That was his word." "Welfare?" She looked up. "He offered to take the deed in exchange for canceling the debt outright. He framed it as a mercy. He has been wanting this land for 3 years, Vernon said, and his voice had something in it she had not heard before, a controlled edge. "I know that now. I did not entirely know it before." She stood up. "He also said that continuing to accept help from a neighboring cattleman without any formal arrangement was creating the wrong kind of talk in town." She watched him absorb this. The controlled edge in his voice became something more careful. "What kind of talk?" he asked. "The kind that men like Dodd use as a trap," she said. "The kind designed to make a woman feel she has to choose between her reputation and her survival." Vernon was quiet for a long moment. The sky was lightening from black to deep blue at the horizon's edge. A meadowlark, the same one or its cousin, began its morning statement somewhere in the grass. "I should have thought of that," he said, and there was something in his voice that sounded like genuine self-reproach. "I was not thinking about how this would look to people who did not understand what we were doing here. I was not thinking about it either," she said. "I was thinking about the Milo, as you should be. But he is not entirely wrong that people are talking." "What do you want to do about it?" he asked. She met his eyes. "I want to finish what I started," she said. "I'm not giving Clarence Dodd this land. I'm not stopping the work because gossips in Canyon Creek need something to occupy their evenings. And I'm not going to pretend that your help has not been the difference between survival and losing everything." He held her gaze for a long time. "Then we keep going," he said. "We keep going," she agreed. But the conversation with Dodd had opened something in the situation that could not be easily closed again. The talk in town was real, and in 1878 in a small Kansas county, talk had consequences. The women at the dry goods store began treating Hazel with a particular careful courtesy that was its own form of judgment. The pastor's wife asked pointed questions about whether Hazel had considered the burden she was placing on her neighbors. Even Pete, who did not speak much, came to work one morning with a slightly uncomfortable look that suggested someone had said something to him. Hazel bore all of it with the same trained stillness she brought to everything. But one evening in early June, sitting alone on the porch after a particularly full day, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what it cost. Not the physical cost, which she could manage. The other cost. The cost of being a woman doing something that most of the people around her had quietly agreed was not a woman's thing to do, and having that effort reframed by every gossip in the county into something small or shameful or suspicious. She was sitting with that feeling when she heard a horse approach and recognized Vernon's gray mare by the sound of her step. He did not ride up to the porch often in the evening. He was scrupulous about the boundaries of the work, careful to contain their partnership to daylight hours and clear practical purposes. She knew, without either of them ever saying it directly, that he was aware of the same pressures the gossips were applying, and that he was navigating them in his own way. He dismounted and stood at the bottom of the porch steps. His hat was in his hand. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what Dodd said. I have been thinking about it too. There is a practical solution that addresses the problem of the talk," he said, "and I want to put it to you honestly, and I want you to feel entirely free to refuse it without any change in what we are doing here." She looked at him steadily. "Say it." "I could ask you to marry me," he said, "not for any hidden motive. Not as a trap or a strategy, but because it would resolve the talk. It would give the land a second name on the deed, which would complicate Dodd's foreclosure significantly, and because he started again, because I think we work well together." The meadowlark had gone quiet by now. The Kansas evening settled around them with its particular mix of wildflower scent and dust and the distant low sound of cattle somewhere on the plain. "You think we work well together," she repeated. "Yes." "Is that all?" He was quiet. And in that quiet, she watched something happen in his face that was neither practiced nor controlled. Something that had been kept at a careful distance from both of them came closer, became visible. "No," he said, "that is not all. But I did not want to make this complicated when you have enough complicated things to manage right now." She felt something move in her that she had not let move in a very long time. Not since Bradley Holt. And what had happened with Bradley Holt had been betrayal of the ordinary kind, which was almost worse than the dramatic kind, because it left no target for the anger and no clean story to tell about the pain. What Vernon Underwood was offering was nothing like that. She could feel the difference the way you felt the difference between shallow soil and deep soil when you pressed your hand into the earth. Something solid and serious lay underneath what he was saying. "I need to finish the season first," she said. He did not look hurt by this. He looked, if anything, like a man who had received an answer he could entirely understand. "Yes," he said, "you do. But the question is not refused," she said quietly. He turned his hat in his hands. "I will take that." He rode back to his own land in the last of the evening light, and Hazel sat on the porch for a long time, looking at the field where the milo was growing and feeling, for the first time in 2 years, something that was not entirely made of effort. June turned to July, and the work intensified. The sorghum was planted on the higher ground and it came up strong, the deep-rooted variety that Vernon had recommended from his years of watching which crops survived the Kansas summers and which ones did not. The milo in the low section was already knee-high by the second week of June, responding to the creek moisture and the carefully managed irrigation channel they had cut together. Hazel learned new things every week. She learned how to read the soil color for moisture content without a testing tool. She learned the difference between wind damage and insect damage on the leaf margins. She learned how to adjust the seed drill for a second pass without losing the row alignment. She learned these things partly from Vernon and partly from her own long attention, and she began to understand that the gap between what she had known and what she needed to know was narrowing daily. Vernon was a good teacher in the specific way of someone who did not know they were teaching. He simply worked alongside her and talked about what he was doing and why, and she absorbed it the way dry soil absorbed water. He never spoke down to her. He never simplified things unnecessarily. When she made a mistake, which happened, as mistakes happen to anyone doing hard work, he addressed it the way he would have addressed it with any competent worker, clearly, directly, without drama. There was a particular afternoon in mid-July that she thought about for a long time afterward. They had been testing the soil moisture in the milo field, the two of them moving down the rows with a sharpened stick to probe the depth of the moisture retention after a dry week, when Vernon crouched down to examine a section of leaves that showed a slight yellowing at the margins. "Sulfur deficiency," he said. "See how the yellowing starts at the new growth and moves outward. Nitrogen deficiency goes the other direction." She crouched beside him, their shoulders almost touching, both of them bent toward the same small piece of evidence that the land was offering. "My father lost a whole stand of wheat to what he thought was drought but was probably this," she said. "I remember him talking about it. He never figured out what it was. It is easy to miss. The plant tells you everything, but you have to know the language." She looked at the plant and then at him. At this distance, she could see the scar on his left hand and the way the sun had weathered his face differently on the left side from years of riding into western afternoons. She felt the warmth that had been growing in her for weeks now, the warmth she had been disciplined about not examining too closely because there was too much work to do. "Vernon," she said. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted to complete attention. "I want you to know," she said carefully, "that whatever happens at the end of the season with the bank, with the debt, with all of it, I would not have gotten here without what you have given me, and I do not mean only the practical help." He was very still. "You have given me the confidence that what I am doing is worth doing, that I am capable of it. That has been," she stopped, found different words. "That has kept me going on the mornings when everything felt impossible." He did not say anything for a moment. Then, "You were already capable of it, Hazel. I did not give you that. It was always there." It was the first time he had used her given name. They had been Mr. Underwood and Miss Lockhart for 3 months, in the careful fashion of their time and place, and the single syllable of her name in his voice in the middle of that July field did something to the air between them that could not be undone. She held his gaze. He held hers. The Kansas sun pressed down on both of them with its complete and total indifference to human emotion, and the milo grew quietly in its rows around them, and something between Hazel Lockhart and Vernon Underwood became irrevocably different from what it had been that morning. He cleared his throat and stood up. "We should get the sulfur application done before the heat peaks." "Yes," she agreed, standing too, her voice almost entirely steady. But she was smiling as she walked back to the supply cart, and she did not try to stop it. The crisis arrived in late July, as crises tended to do, at the worst possible moment and in the worst possible shape. A man named Gideon Marsh rode onto her property on a Tuesday morning with a paper in his hand and a look of professional pleasantness that did not extend anywhere near his eyes. He was Clarence Dodd's attorney, a man who had moved to Canyon Creek from Topeka the previous year, and who wore his city suits as though they were armor. "Miss Lockhart," he said from horseback, "I am here on behalf of the First Territorial Bank to conduct a formal assessment of the property's status in relation to the outstanding debt obligation." Hazel set down her hoe. "Mr. Dodd sent an assessment in writing in April. The terms were October 1st. "There is a new development," Marsh said, unfolding the paper with an actor's timing. "The original debt note includes a provision for mid-season assessment at the bank's discretion in cases where there is reasonable doubt as to the debtor's capacity to produce. Mr. Dodd has invoked that provision." She went cold, not with fear exactly, with the particular clarity that came when you recognized a trap that had been set before you even arrived at the field. "Show me the provision," she said. He handed over the paper. She read it with the careful attention of someone who understood that the devil in such documents lived in the secondary clauses and the subordinate language. There it was, buried in paragraph 4, the mid-season assessment clause, the kind of language that meant nothing on a good year and everything on a year when someone wanted to exercise it. "This gives the bank the right to accelerate the foreclosure timeline if the mid-season assessment indicates insufficient progress," she said. "That is correct." "What constitutes sufficient progress?" "That is at the bank's discretion." She folded the paper and handed it back with a hand that was completely, professionally steady. "When is the assessment?" "Friday. Mr. Dodd will conduct it personally." When Marsh rode away, Hazel stood in the middle of the field for a long moment with her hands open at her sides and her face turned toward the soil she was fighting for. Then she went to saddle Prophet. Vernon was at his east pasture when she arrived, mending a section of fence line that one of his bulls had decided was merely a suggestion. He looked up when he heard her coming and took one look at her face. "What happened?" he said. She told him. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she had come to value most in him. When she finished, he set down his fence pliers and was quiet for a count of 10. "The provision is real," he said. "I have seen it used before. Old man Watkins lost his property to Dodd 2 years ago on the same clause. I know. The crop is good, Hazel. Anyone with honest eyes can see it." "Dodd's eyes have a hidden motive," she said. "They have had one since before my father died. He wants this land connected to his southern holdings. It is about access to the creek." Vernon was quiet again. Then, "There is something you should know," he said carefully. "Something I should have told you earlier and did not because I was not sure how you would receive it." She looked at him. The careful tone set her nerves on edge. "Say it." "When your father was first falling behind, 3 years ago, Dodd approached me. He wanted me to buy your father's land. Not because he wanted me to have it, but because he knew I would eventually sell it to him, and he did not want the appearance of taking it directly from a struggling family. He wanted a respectable intermediary." Something moved through her. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I was not in the business of helping men pick the bones of their neighbors." He met her gaze without flinching. "I also told him that if the Lockhart land ever came to market legitimately, the Lockhart family would have a fair deal from me, not a starvation price engineered by foreclosure." He did not like that answer. "How long have you known about the creek access issue?" 2 years, maybe a little longer." She absorbed this, turned it over, examined it for the shape of betrayal and found something else instead. "You have been watching out for this land," she said slowly. "Before I was even here to watch out for it myself. I was watching out for your father," he said, and then he stopped. "And then for you." The honesty in those last 3 words sat between them in the morning air. She looked at this man, this complicated, capable, quietly certain man who had spent years paying attention to what mattered to her without making it her burden to manage. "We need a plan for Friday," she said. "Yes, we do." They spent the rest of that day, and the 2 that followed preparing for Dodd's assessment in a way that was, Hazel thought, probably not what Dodd had intended to provoke. They walked every inch of the cultivated sections and documented the crop's status in writing. Vernon's neat hand recording stand density and plant height, an estimated yield per acre, based on his years of comparable data from his own fields. Hazel drew a detailed map of the planting layout from memory, annotating each section with dates and methods, and the soil conditions that made the choices she had made the correct ones. They brought in Sam Beaumont, the older farmer who worked a neighboring section to the east and who had no connection to Dodd's interests, and asked him to walk the field and give his honest assessment, which he did after a long and thorough survey that included tasting soil from 3 different sections like a doctor tasting medicine. "This is a good stand," Sam told her, wiping the dirt from his palm on his trousers. "The milo is about as strong as I have seen on this ground. The sorghum will need rain in the next 2 weeks, or it will be lighter than you want. But if the rain comes, and the long range looks reasonable for once, you are going to produce." "Would you be willing to say that to the bank's representative on Friday?" she asked. Sam looked at her with the measured evaluation of a man deciding something. He looked at Vernon. Something passed between the two men that was the long language of people who had been neighbors long enough to know each other's character without ceremony. "Yes," Sam said, "I will be here Friday." Clarence Dodd arrived at 10 in the morning on Friday with Marsh the attorney and a man called Fielding, whom Hazel did not know, but Vernon recognized as a land assessor from Topeka, who had done Dodd's dirty work in previous foreclosures. Hazel met them at the gate in her clean work clothes with her written documentation in her hand, and Sam Beaumont standing to her left and Vernon Underwood standing to her right. She had thought carefully about that arrangement, about what it said and what it needed to say. Vernon was there as a neighbor and a witness, not as a protector or a substitute authority. She was the one who spoke first, and she was the one who held the papers. "Mr. Dodd," she said, "thank you for coming. I would like to walk you through the field myself." Dodd was in his mid-50s, prosperous-looking in the particular way that came from doing prosperous things at other people's expense. He looked at her assembled support with an expression that did not change on its surface but shifted in its calculation. "Miss Lockhart," he said, "Underwood, Beaumont," a nod for each of them. "Let us proceed." She led them through the milo first, the strongest stand, and she spoke with precision and confidence about every decision she had made and why. She cited soil conditions and drainage patterns and moisture retention data that she and Vernon had tested and recorded. She let the crops speak for themselves, which they did, standing knee-high and healthy in their ordered rows under the Kansas sun. Fielding, the land assessor from Topeka, walked beside her and asked technical questions in the practiced tone of a man looking for weak points. She answered every one. When he asked about the projected yield, she gave him the number she and Vernon had calculated and the comparable data from Sam's neighboring operation that supported it. When he asked about the risk of late-season drought, she showed him the irrigation channel and explained the drainage strategy. Sam offered his assessment unprompted at the end of the walk, standing in the middle of the milo with his hat in his hand and speaking in the flat, completely credible voice of a man who had farmed this particular Kansas county for 32 years. "This is a good stand and a well-managed season," he said. "I would bet my own seed stock on this harvest coming in." Dodd looked at all of it. He looked at the crops and the documentation and the two men who were there as neighbors and honest witnesses, and at the woman who had walked him through all of it with the calm precision of someone who had done everything right and knew it. "The mid-season assessment will be filed as satisfactory," Marsh said finally, writing something on his paper with his pen. Dodd said nothing. He looked at the milo one more time with an expression that had moved beyond calculation into something Hazel could only describe as reluctant recognition. Then he turned and walked back to his horse and rode away without further conversation. Hazel waited until the sound of the horses faded before she let the breath out of her body. "He will try again," Vernon said quietly beside her. "Let him," she said. Sam Beaumont laughed, a short bark of genuine amusement, and slapped his hat against his knee. "Well done, Hazel Lockhart," he said. Your daddy would have enjoyed that. She thought of her father then, of Thomas Edward Lockhart, who had crossed half a country for 30 acres of hard Kansas ground and had never found the key to making it produce. She thought of what it would mean to succeed where he had not as a rebuke to his memory, but as a completion of the thing he had started, as proof that the land had always been capable, that it had only needed different hands or different knowledge or both. Yes, she said, I think he would have. August arrived like a hammer. The heat of August in Kansas in 1878 was the kind of heat that had no patience for sentiment. It was 104 degrees for 3 consecutive days in the second week of the month, and the air smelled of hot grass and distant smoke from somewhere northwest, and the creek dropped 4 inches in a week. The sorghum was the vulnerable crop. The milo, deep-rooted and stubborn, handled the heat without visible complaint. But the sorghum showed stress in its upper leaves, a slight curl that Hazel had seen before and understood. She needed rain, or she needed to sacrifice the outer rows to save the core stand. Vernon came every morning now, every single morning, and he did not pretend anymore that there was any distance between his investment in this harvest and his investment in her. The pretense had dissolved somewhere in the walk through the Milo field with Dodd, or maybe earlier, in the July afternoon with the sulfur deficiency, or maybe earlier still, in the February frost when he had arrived with canvas in the dark without being asked. They worked the water management strategy together for 3 straight days, diverting every available drop of creek water to the sorghum, rose through a series of small channel adjustments that required digging in the hottest part of the afternoons. Pete was back and working. Sam Beaumont's son, a quiet young man named George, came over 2 days running to help with the digging because that was how it worked in a farm community that had not yet been entirely poisoned by the kind of competition that men like Dodd encouraged. On the 3rd day, when they were making the last channel adjustment in the late afternoon and the temperature was still above 95, Vernon's hand closed briefly over hers on the handle of the spade when they were moving it to a new position. Just for a moment, just long enough to be intentional. She did not move her hand away. She looked at him. He looked at her. And then the channel needed to be cut, and they cut it. But the moment had happened, and they both carried it through the rest of the afternoon with the careful consciousness of people who are holding something new and fragile. The rain came on the 14th of August. Not a gentle rain, not in Kansas, where the sky saved everything up for weeks and then gave it back in argument. It came with thunder that shook the house windows and lightning that lit the whole flat country like noon at midnight, and it rained for 14 hours without meaningful interruption. Hazel stood on her porch at 3 in the morning and listened to it. She was still dressed, having been too alert with something between anxiety and hope to sleep. The sorghum needed this rain. The sorghum was going to get this rain. She stood and listened to the sound of her crops drinking. She heard a boot on the step and was not surprised to find Vernon there in the dark with rain dripping from his hat brim. "Your channel's held," he said. "I checked the south section. The runoff is going where it should." "Come out of the rain," she said. He came up onto the porch, and they stood together listening to the storm settle into the plains around them. The lantern she had hanging cast a small, warm circle over the boards, and the rest of the world was darkness and rain and the sound of the land receiving what it needed. "I have been thinking about what I said," he said finally. "At the beginning of June." She waited. "I want you to know that it stands," he said. "Whatever the season produces, whatever October brings, the question stands, and it is not a practical question. I was wrong to frame it partly as a practical thing. It is not practical." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the rain. "What is it then?" she asked. He turned and looked at her. The lantern light was doing something warm and honest to his face, showing her the man who had been here every morning, who had never doubted, who had kept his own counsel about his feelings until the work was done because he understood, perhaps better than she had, that she needed to earn this season for herself, and that his admiration could not be allowed to crowd that out. "It is the rest of my life," he said, "if you will have it." Hazel Lockhart stood on her porch in the summer rain of 1878 and felt the full weight of what she had been building. Not just the crop, not just the debt she was fighting, but this. The slow, careful construction of something true between two people who had been honest with each other from the first morning. No betrayal, no hidden motives on either side, no forced choice between survival and desire. "Yes," she said, "I will have it." He reached across the small space between them and took her hand, the rough, calloused palm against her equally rough, calloused palm, and they stood together in the rain sound, listening to August do its work on the land. September was the proof of everything. The harvest began in the second week of September, which was earlier than traditional winter wheat would have allowed, and exactly on the schedule that Vernon had projected back in April, when Hazel had first looked at him across her father's dead wheat field, and decided to trust an honest answer. The Milo came in first, thick-headed and heavy, with the deep cream-colored grain that was currently fetching good prices at the Canyon Creek elevator because of a shortage further east. They hired 3 extra hands for the cutting, local men who were between their own harvests and willing to work for a fair daily wage. Hazel managed the crew schedule and the hauling logistics herself, drawing on 3 months of accumulated practical knowledge and the natural authority of someone who had made every decision on this operation and understood its needs from the inside out. Vernon was there every day, as he had been every day, but there was a new quality to his presence now, warmer and less contained. The way a man was when the thing he had been careful about was no longer a secret between them. He did not do her work for her. He managed his own role in the operation with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. But there were small things, moments, a hand steadied on the wagon side when she climbed up, a water tin passed across without asking whether she needed it, a look held a beat past its working purpose. Pete noticed. George Beaumont noticed. The 3 hired hands had clearly noticed long before the principals were aware of being noticed. None of them said a word, because Kansas farm workers in 1878 had the practical wisdom to keep their observations to themselves, but the atmosphere around the harvest had the particular quality of a thing being done in a state of grace. Hazel recorded the yield as they went. Her small ledger book, which had previously contained only debt calculations and expense figures, began to fill with numbers that moved in the right direction. Milo, 42 bushels per acre on the low section. Sorghum, 38 bushels per acre from the high ground, slightly below Vernon's best-case projection but well within the range for a good price. Total projected revenue at current market prices before expenses, $1,130. $912 was the debt. She did the arithmetic 3 times on 3 separate evenings to make sure she was not making an error born of desperate hope. She was not making an error. She would clear the debt with something left over. On the morning she completed the final harvest calculations, she sat at her kitchen table with the ledger open and the numbers staring up at her in her own handwriting, and she felt something she had not felt in 2 years. Not relief exactly, not triumph, though that was part of it. Something quieter and more permanent, the feeling of a foundation under her feet. She rode into Canyon Creek that afternoon with a sealed envelope containing her first payment against the debt, enough to demonstrate the trajectory clearly, and she placed it on Clarence Dodd's desk with the satisfaction of a person who has won not by luck but by work. Dodd looked at the envelope. He looked at her. Something in him acknowledged what it meant, which was that the trap had not closed and would not close. "The full balance will be cleared by October 1st, she said. "I will bring a bank draft for the remainder when the elevator issues final payment." "I see," he said. "I trust the bank will have no further concerns about the property's status," she said. Dodd said nothing. His attorney, Marsh, made a note. Hazel rode home with the Kansas sky enormous above her, and the full length of September ahead, and the knowledge that she had done the thing nobody had been sure she could do, except for one man who had never for a single moment doubted her. Vernon asked her father's closest friend, a man named Elijah Croft, who had worked the neighboring section before retiring to town, to act as the responsible elder in the marriage arrangements, since both her parents were gone. Hazel appreciated this more than she knew how to say. In a society that still required a woman to have male authorization for certain legal proceedings, Vernon had found a way to honor the form without making her feel its indignity. Elijah Croft was 67 years old and had known Hazel since she was 4, and he treated the arrangement with the seriousness it deserved. The wedding was on the 15th of October, 2 weeks after the debt had been paid in full with a bank draft that Hazel had handed across Dodd's desk, with the steady hand she had trained herself into, and the absolute unshakable certainty of a woman who had earned what she was holding. The ceremony was simple and outdoors, and the weather was perfect in the way that Kansas sometimes was in mid-October, cool and high-skied with a faint smell of cured hay from the surrounding operations. Sam Beaumont and his wife Margaret were there. Pete came, cleaned up so thoroughly that he was nearly unrecognizable. Elijah Croft stood up with appropriate gravity and emotional honesty. George Beaumont's fiddle produced something that was technically a hymn, but had enough personality to pass for a celebration. When Vernon took her hand before the pastor, she looked at his face, this face she had been looking at across fields and fence lines and water channels for 6 months, and she saw in it what she had seen from the beginning without fully naming it: the absolute absence of doubt. Not the false confidence of a man who had never failed, but the earned certainty of a man who paid attention and trusted what he saw. He had always trusted what he saw in her. She had spent most of her life wishing someone would. "Hazel," he said before the formal words, just her name, just that. "Vernon," she said back. And the pastor said the words, and the two of them said the words back in something that had been building since April, since the first honest conversation at the fence line over a dying wheat field, completed itself in the October light. The years that followed were built on the foundation of that one season, and they were good years, the kind that required work and brought reward in proportion to the work, and occasionally brought surprises that no amount of preparation could anticipate. The 30 acres became 60. Vernon folded the Lockhart parcel into the management of the larger operation, but they were careful, both of them, to maintain the legal and practical distinctness of the Lockhart deed, because it mattered to Hazel, and Vernon understood why it mattered and never once suggested otherwise. The land her father had crossed half a country to reach remained in her name and produced good harvests for the rest of their lives together. Clarence Dodd made one more attempt at interference in the spring of 1879, sending Marsh with a revised offer framed as a business proposition rather than a foreclosure. Vernon happened to be standing at Hazel's shoulder when Marsh arrived, not by design, simply because that was where he spent most mornings, and the two of them looked at the offer together and declined it with a courtesy that was entirely genuine and entirely final. Dodd transferred his attentions to another parcel further north after that, and the Underwood operation was left to go about its business in peace. Their first child was a boy, born in the summer of 1880, a fact that Sam Beaumont's wife Margaret treated as confirmation of some private prediction she had made. They named him Thomas Edward Underwood, after Hazel's father, which seemed right. He was born with Vernon's dark eyes and Hazel's stubborn attention, and from the time he could walk, he followed his mother around the fields in the way that children followed the parent who seemed most certain of where they were going. The second child was a girl, born in 1882, and they named her Clara after Vernon's one decent memory of his Tennessee childhood, a sister who had been kind to him before he left, and who he had carried in his heart across the country. Clara was quieter than Thomas, but no less decided about things, and she had her father's gift for knowing what a piece of land could produce just by looking at it with careful eyes. There was a drought year in 1883 that tested everything, the way droughts tested everything in Kansas, without mercy and without apology. But by then, Hazel had 6 years of accumulated practical knowledge, a husband who knew every inch of their combined holdings, a neighborhood network of farmers who had been shaped by the example of the season that had started it all, and the deep roots of a managed operation that had been built for exactly this kind of test. They lost a quarter of that year's sorghum. They did not lose anything that could not be replanted. In the evenings, when the work was done, and the children were in bed, and the two of them sat together on the porch that Hazel had enlarged with Vernon's help in the fall of 1879, the conversation between them had the quality of all long conversations between people who have earned their understanding of each other. They talked about the crops and the cattle and the children's progress and the news from town and the sky over the plains, which was always worth talking about because it was never the same sky twice. Sometimes they were quiet together, the specific comfortable quiet of people who had stopped needing to fill every space. Sometimes, on the evenings when the light was right and the day had been the right kind of hard, Vernon would look at her from across the porch, and his expression would hold the same thing it had held that October morning outside the pastor's house, that absolute unshaken certainty, and she would feel it settle into her the way rain settled into good deep soil. She had spent a long time believing that the worst thing about her life was its fragility, the land that could be taken, the people who left, the debt that accumulated, the world that arranged its standards to make her work harder for half the credit. What she understood now was that the fragility had been real, but it had not been the whole truth. The whole truth included this porch and this man and these children, and this soil that was hers and producing and known. The whole truth included the season that had required everything she had and given her back something larger. She had been told, by implication and by letter and by the careful social management of 100 small expectations, that she was not sufficient for the task. That the land required more than a woman alone could provide. What the land had actually required was exactly what she had given it: understanding, attention, work of the most serious kind. A willingness to learn what she did not know and to trust the person who offered honest knowledge freely, without hidden motive, without the trap of condescension. In the spring of 1884, 6 years after the season that had changed everything, Hazel Lockhart Underwood stood in the Milo field on a morning very like the morning she had first stood there with a dead wheat crop at her back and a banker's letter in her pocket. She was 32 now, the same age Vernon had been when they met. Thomas was 4 and standing beside her with his small boots sinking slightly into the turned soil, the way small boots always did. Clara would be 2 in June. Vernon came across the field from the barn, where he had been checking on a calf that had been born the previous night. His hat was on the back of his head in the manner of a man who had been working since before sunrise and hadn't stopped to set it right. He looked at her across the field and she looked at him. "How is the calf?" she asked. "Healthy, hungry, loud about both." He came up beside her and looked at the prepared rows, the seed drill standing ready at the field's edge, the good dark soil turned and waiting. "The creek is running high this year, good sign for the low section. I was thinking sorghum again on the high ground," she said, "and the Milo in the low." "Same as the first year," he said. "Same as the first year," she agreed. "It worked." He looked at her with the steady dark eyes that had never wavered, not once in 6 years, not in doubt or condescension or the quiet assumption that someone else should be making the decisions about her land. Thomas tugged at her hand. "Mama, can I put in the first seeds?" She looked down at her son, this small, serious person who had come out of her life and Vernon's life, and the season that had made both of them what they were now. She bent down and put a handful of Milo seed into his cupped hands. "Carefully," she said, 6 inches deep. Follow the line your father made." Thomas moved toward the first row with the intense concentration of a 4-year-old given a serious task. Vernon watched him with an expression that was purely love, undiluted and unhidden. "One more," Hazel said quietly, not looking away from her son. Vernon turned to her. She met his eyes. He understood what she meant, not just the question in it, but the readiness in it, the same readiness that had always been present in her but that had needed the right season to fully emerge. "Yes," he said. "One more." She smiled, and he smiled, and Thomas deposited his seeds with tremendous solemnity at the head of the row, and the Kansas sky above them was enormous and blue and full of the specific promise of a spring that was going to be good. She had been given one season to prove she could work the land. She had proven it not once but every season since, in the steadily expanding language of a life built by her own hands on the ground her father had loved, and her husband had believed in, and her children were learning to read with their feet and their fingers and their patient inheritance of attention. Vernon Underwood had never doubted she could. And in that certainty, which had never been a gift of charity but a recognition of truth, she had found the truest thing she had ever been given. Not the season itself, not even the harvest, though the harvest had been everything. The truest thing had been being seen accurately by someone who paid attention, being known for what she actually was rather than diminished for what the world expected her not to be. That was what she carried. That was what had taken root in her, deeper than the milo, deeper than the sorghum, deeper than any crop that could be measured in bushels or dollars or the cold arithmetic of a banker's ledger. That was what grew in the space between two people who had chosen each other honestly, who had worked the same ground together without pretense, who had let the season be what it was, hard and real and capable of producing everything it had always held inside itself, waiting for someone to trust it enough to begin. The porch was quiet that evening when the children were down, and the stars over Kansas were as dense and close as they always were in the clear April dark. Vernon brought 2 cups of coffee to where Hazel was sitting and set one beside her hand and settled into the chair beside hers. The smell of turned earth and new grass came across the field on the night air. Somewhere in the south section, a nighthawk called its descending spiral of sound over the waiting ground. "It is a good life," she said. "Yes," he said, "it is." They sat together in the full and finished quiet of people who had built something real and knew it and did not need to say more than that. The land lay dark and breathing around them. The creek ran. The stars moved in their slow, enormous courses overhead. And the season, which had been her one season, the season that had asked everything of her and given her back everything that mattered, had become simply their life, continuous and true and full of the kind of beauty that only grows in soil that has been honestly worked. Hazel Lockhart Underwood set her coffee cup on the rail and looked at the field and felt, as she always felt at this hour on these evenings, exactly where she was, exactly who she was, exactly what she had made and what had made her, and how completely those two things had become the same thing. She reached over and found Vernon's hand in the dark. He turned his palm up to hold hers. The nighthawk called again, farther out now, over the wide open country, and the Kansas night received the sound the way it received everything, entirely, without reservation, with the limitless capacity of deep ground that had been waiting a long time to be trusted. She trusted it. She had always trusted it, and it had given back exactly what she gave.